Great. So just for the question we have on the table for Dr. Kim is just general guidance and tips sort of on cleaning data, specifically if you've collected primary survey data and you're anticipating analyzing it and anxious about how to transform variables, what needs to be categorized or dichotomized, et cetera, in order to prepare for analysis. And without any very specific questions right now, just sort of thinking about general guidance on how to, and I always like to ask about the sort of mistakes you see people making and how to be on the lookout for them and avoid them. So I'll hand it over to you, Kwang-Young Kim. Thank you.
Do we want Dr. Kim to introduce himself really quick?
Oh, sure. Yes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that prompt. So my name is Kwang-Young Kim. Kim is my last name. You could call me Kwang-Young. You could call me Dr. Kim, whichever you feel comfortable with. So I've been with the Biostat Collaboration Center since 2007. I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Preventive Medicine. I am a statistical geneticist by training, but also cover a host of topics in statistics, including survey design and so forth. So I could give you a lot of general guidelines of just what I've seen in the past and what types of data are particularly very difficult to analyze when I receive them. Some of them take a host of time just to clean it up. So anyway, so I've seen some data when I first receive it. I've seen data that are colored. So a lot of the residents, sometimes what they do is, they want to indicate which ones are important, and so they would color them. Color does not translate into any sort of meaningful language when you import the data. So I would say, let's start with the non-colored data. The other thing is, so when you're presented with the data, usually the way that we think about the format of the data is that you have the observations, which are the rows, and then you have the columns, which are the variables. So, imagine if you have 100 observations, 100 individuals, and then you gave out 100 surveys. So, and then let's say, 100 surveys, so 100 individuals, and then let's say there were 10 survey items for that 100 individuals, then you would have 10 columns. So that's sort of, very naive way of thinking. So the columns are the variables, and then the rows are the observations or the samples or individuals. And then you could also think of, if you have longitudinal data set, you could imagine you would have a much longer format. So usually the way that you organize the data when you have longitudinal data is they call it the long format versus the wide format. There are certain different terms that are being used now. What is the exact term they use now instead of wide and long? Because that's all relative. I think it's either the longer or wider. I forget the exact terminology. But one of the more popular software to analyze data set these days is R, the letter R. It's a freeware, and there's been a lot of development in trying to analyze the longitudinal data set and how to read in those data, convert the data, and so forth. So usually when you have a longitudinal data set, you would organize, let's say it's in a longer format. So, and let's say you have 100 observations, and then, 100 individuals, and each of those individuals were collected at 10 different time points. You're collecting 10 survey items. You still have 10 columns, but then each individual would have 10 rows. So now you have 10 by 100 rows, which is 1,000 rows. So those would be the longer format in how you collect them. So that's just kind of the general idea of how you would collect data. Of course, some of the data sets are extremely complicated. You would have natural language processing data. You may have, gene expression data, DNA data. So those may be a little bit more complicated, but just generally speaking, the types of data that we collect are, you could think of it in a rectangular format. And then if you have multiple data sets, let's say you had 10 survey tools, and each of those tools were saved in a different spreadsheet, then you would have to at some point merge them. So then you would have to have a common column that you could merge by. And so then that would be, say, a personal ID, some sort of ID that each person could be uniquely identified by. And if that could be de-identified, that's even better. So let's say you had like hospital ID that is sensitive, and then you could just convert that to something that is de-identifiable, and you could convert it that way, or merge it that way. So you have to make sure that all of these IDs have no errors, because when you merge them, it still merges, because even if the ID is slightly different, but then you won't realize that the merged data is actually not correct, because if the ID is not exactly the same, then it may think that those are two different IDs. And so you have actually two additional rows, or one additional row in your merged data set. So things like that. And then just some general comments about missing data. So missing data is, again, it's probably a very real problem in survey data. You would have missing data in, perhaps some of the items, and maybe certain individuals may have more missing for a particular individual, and then maybe certain items just in general may be more missing. So those could be a little problematic, because there may be a reason why they're missing. So in terms of mechanisms of missing, there's missing at random, missing completely at random, and there's missing not missing at random. So depending on what the mechanism is, and if you analyze the data set, let's say you have a data set where it's not missing at random, but then you just assume that it's missing at random and you apply the methods as if it were missing at random, then you would get biased results. So without knowing, the problem with the statistical software is if you run the data analysis, it usually does not complain. It would give you the results anyway. It does not mean it's correct. And that's why I think statisticians will never run out of their jobs, because we need to check the assumptions. And that's not what something computers can do. And so you have to really know, why are certain things missing? And so you have to kind of look deeply into why that mechanism may be there. So, certain things that you could do is you could do like pattern mixture modeling. There are certain ways you could do some sensitivity analysis. There are certain ways you could apply methods and see if missingness is indeed a problem. And of course, if you have too much missing data, then you probably don't want to include that in the first place. You may want to investigate why you have so much missing data to begin with. What else can I talk about? Any other specific questions that you may have along those lines?
No, Anisha Pin has joined us, who's a predoctoral trainee, working, I've forgotten who you're working with. Bruce Tan.
Dr. Bruce Tan,
Yeah. I don't. You started in January. I don't know if you've actually approached any sort of study design or statistical issues, or if you had any particular questions. But Shawnice is a postdoc who's doing working with survey data, and looking forward to this moment when these big questions about analyzing the data comes up. So that's how we got to be talking about that.
Oh yes, yeah. Going back to, I'm sorry, but going back to your question about dichotomous versus continuous. So dichotomous, if you have a dichotomous data, you could either look at individual items where, if that dichotomous item happens to be the outcome, then you could use say a logistic regression where you're looking at 1 versus 0, for example. And if you want to correlate that with other covariates, for example, if that survey item was, what kind of examples can I get? So let's say if it was like do you smoke or do you not smoke? Yes or no. So then that's probably a covariate that and so then you could, and then whatever that outcome is, so is smoking related to lung cancer? So then your lung cancer would be your outcome. So in that case, it would be yes or no. So that would be a logistic regression. But let's say you're looking at some sort of gene expression level as your outcome, and then you're linking your smoking level, then it would be just a typical regression because your y is a continuous variable. But if that smoking status, if that survey question was not smoking status, but rather, I don't know, do you live in a poverty area, yes or no? Perhaps that could be an outcome that you're trying to link that with certain other variables. So depending on how you phrase the question or what kind of variables are collected in the survey item, it could be your X, it could be your Y, and depending on that, a dichotomous variable may be used as a logistic regression if that itself is the outcome. But if that's simply a predictor that you're trying to link that or associate that with an outcome that is continuous, such as gene expression value, then you're using a linear regression instead of a logistic regression. A lot of times you could combine the different survey items and then come up with a score. So if you're trying to see if there's, if certain risk, your lifestyle risk is associated with a certain outcome, and you've collected, say, 10 items that are that are related to life risk variables, then perhaps you can just sum them up, and that would be sort of the weight that you bear as a lifestyle choice. And so maybe it could range from 0 to 10, 10 being the worst and 0 being the best, or vice versa. So that's another way of sort of collapsing your dichotomous variable into a continuous. It's not really continuous because it can't take on any value. It could only take on either 0, 1, all the way to 10. It could only take on integers, but you could sort of think of it as a continuous variable. And then also, if you have count data, then you have to use, say, a Poisson distribution or a negative binomial regression, and then try to do it that way. So a lot of the models really depend on what the variable types are. So you have to truly understand what is the distribution of the variable, and then start from there. The other comment that I wanted to make is, before you do any kind of analysis, any type of modeling, the first thing I would recommend is just looking at the data visually and tabulate a lot of the data. So then you can immediately realize, oh yeah, why is variable 1, why does that variable have 60% missing data? And if you tabulate it, it's very obvious. Sometimes you may miss that if you have so many different columns with so many different rows, you may not see how much of it are missing. And then also when you plot it out, you may see, oh yeah, why is it that most of the data points are concentrated near 0, but then you've got few data points that are way out in the thousands. So perhaps you had some typo in and that was an order or 2 orders of magnitude just out of range. So things like that are easily visible when you plot them. And then also, if you need to test if something is normally distributed, you could always do a QQ plot, and QQ plots would give you a good guidance of whether it follows a normal distribution or Gaussian distribution. And if not, then you probably have to think about, oh, yeah, maybe I need to transform the data using log transformation or some other transformations that would make it normally distributed. And then, of course, when you do that, you always have to back transform if you have to interpret the data in the original scale. So things like that. So I would always suggest looking at the data visually first, and then after you're confident about knowing what the distribution of the data is, then you could start analyzing the data. Otherwise, it's really meaningless if it violates all the assumptions and then you run linear regression or ANOVA or logistic regression. The conclusion that you get is probably not correct, or it may be similar to correctness, but it's not completely correct. So always check the assumptions, look at the data, and the other thing is you may have correlated data. When you're when you're running regression models, and let's say you're looking at gene expression, which is your Y, and then you're correlating that with survey items, and the 2 survey items are essentially the same, then you have problem, because now you run into collinearity. So survey item 1 and survey item 2 may be virtually identical, so including both does not make sense. So in that case, again, maybe you can collapse the survey items by coming up with a score, or you could use some other some other regression methods where you reduce the number of covariates. So there are methods where you can reduce the beta coefficients to close to 0, such as lasso or ridge regression, things like that. You could use those kind of methods and try to reduce the number of dimensions for your covariates. So effectively eliminating some of the survey items that are not required for the models. So things of that nature. So again, just always start from the graph and then move from there and then see which models are appropriate, know your assumptions, and model it that way. Okay, so that was that about the dichotomous. And then just in terms of the modeling, so a lot of the times, if you just simply want to know if something is the same or different from one another, you could carry out a t-test. If you have a continuous variable, it follows relatively a normal distribution, and you want to compare the mean between group 1 and group 2, you could do a t-test. But then the caveat is that those two groups have to be comparable. So if it's a randomized controlled trial and you randomize the group into group 1 and group 2, then chances are that those two groups are quite similar because you're not selecting them on any specific values. But if you have a case control study, you're comparing cases versus controls, it's probably they're probably very different in terms of their patient characteristics. So if you don't adjust for any differences between those two groups, then what happens is that you're not really testing for the differences of cases versus controls, but simply what are just different about those two groups that are not necessarily related to, say, the disease. And so you have to, in those cases, you can't simply use t-tests. So t-tests are great if the groups are comparable. It's just a very simple way of doing things. But then if you have groups that are not comparable, then you may have to use some sort of modeling approach, whether that's linear regression or logistic regression. So these regression methods, the beauty of those methods is because you could include covariates. So, let's say you're testing for the effect of, let's say you're doing, I don't know, some sort of trial, even though it's randomized, let's say you want to make sure that everything is balanced and you want to correct for that, then you could adjust for, say, age, sex, and other covariates. And then on top of that, if you adjust for everything and make it equal, is there still an intervention effect? So that's why you would adjust for things. And that's particularly important when you have case control studies, because you would have to adjust for those variables to kind of even the playing field between the two groups. And then you would want to test to see if there's any differences. So just general methodology or general strategy of how to model. And then also in terms of which variables to include in the models to begin with. So there are two schools of thoughts. One is if you think certain variables are really important to control for, even if they're not different or they're not significant in the model, some people include them anyway. I am usually not in favor of that, because when you do include variables that are not necessarily to control for, there's always additional power that may be an issue, or in terms of like the variance of other estimates may be affected by it. So I don't necessarily like it, but some investigators are very adamant in including certain variables, and that's okay. So in that case, if you think adjusting for socioeconomic status is really important, then even though it's not a variable that is actually significant, maybe you could. So that's one way of doing it in terms of just knowing the science behind it. The other way is you could sort of use the model selection approach, where you start eliminating, you could start with, say, 10 variables, whether they're significant or not, and then you start eliminating the ones that are not significant. And so maybe at the end, you're left with 2 variables that you're controlling for. Or you could do sort of forward, where you start from nothing and then start including the ones that are significant. One thing that is sort of not in favor now is the stepwise approach, where you go forward and then backwards depending on the significance. There's been some issues that have been discussed about that approach. So it's usually backwards or forwards that are more in favor when it comes to modeling approach, or model selection approach, or variable selection approach. Okay, so any other specific questions that you want me to address?
Can I ask you a question about, as you said, sort of whether you should use certain controls, if the controls don't end up being, significant? I mean, is it just at that point, sort of in the literature, you just have to make a best of, what makes sense, whether, and then I guess just note it, because I have a similar issue. So I work on vitamin D, and what I was looking at are the determinants in adulthood and childhood that lead to your adult vitamin D levels, and and I tested BMI versus adiposity, and it seemed like adiposity skin folds were more they were correlated, so I used that in my model. But as I continued to put in other things such as assets, and then if I controlled for sex, because I was really interested in the dynamics between males and females, adiposity actually it wasn't significant when I put it in the full model. Mm-hmm. And I know it's popular to control for because it's fat soluble vitamin. So I go back and forth on whether I should include it, even though my model, like in terms of, I was very logical in how I sort of approached everything, on whether I should still include it or if I should just, make a note of it. And not.
Did you also test for the interaction between those variables?
It was a while ago, but I think I did, but perhaps I should do it again to make sure.
Right. So, I mean, generally speaking, for me, if I had to do the modeling, I would probably not include them if they're not significant. But I would always test for the interaction too. Sometimes when you do include interaction, you may get very different results, especially when there was interaction and you didn't include. So interaction is, in the modeling approach, you could do a multiplication between the 2 variables. And so you would have, say, sex plus age plus sex times age. So that would be the interaction between those 2 variables. And sometimes when you do that, you may get very different results, because what that's saying is that the effective age is very different between males and females. Just definitely test for that. And going back to your question about whether to include them or not include them, I mean, statistically speaking, I think it's better to not include them. But if you believe that, still think you have to adjust for them, then as long as you justify for them and you have enough N, if the sample size is big enough that you could include those variables, then I wouldn't be completely against it.
Okay, yeah, I know that there's sort of the 2 camps, the statistical, like what does the math say versus what is the research or data, sort of theory. But thank you for that. That's helpful. Mm-hmm.
So I think those are kind of the general theme that you would encounter no matter what research area that you're in. You probably have to do some sort of testing. You have to do some sort of modeling, whether that model is a complicated model or a relatively simple model. At the end of the day, you're trying to find some sort of association between 2 variables or a number of variables or you want to know if your intervention works, or if it doesn't work, is it the same as before? So it's usually some sort of modeling approach, because unless you have such a clean design that you could carry out a t-test. You could always start with the t-test, but with the caveat that you do have to know if there are things that you need to control for, you have to control for. In terms of what types of model to use, it depends on the variable distribution. If your outcome is continuous, then you could use some sort of linear regression model. The other thing I want to say is that when people say linear regression, it doesn't mean that it's linear in the outcome. It's really linear in the beta. When you write down in terms of matrix form, it's y equals x beta. So that form itself is called linear. So you may have, variables, say not just your x, but you could have x squared or even x cubed. Those could all be included in the matrix. And so it's still a linear regression in a sense. So it's linear in the betas, so they say. But then you would have nonlinear data when your outcome takes on certain different forms, or if your x cannot be expressed in terms of x beta format. But there are much more complicated regression forms, or there's also, we talked about model selection, but model selection could be built into the modeling itself. So such as lasso or ridge regression, or some version of those two, which is elastic net. If you do that, then it's actually doing the model selection for you in the model, because it's reducing certain variables either down to zero or very close to zero. And in effect, it's sort of doing the model selection for you. So if you started with 10 variables and 8 of them turn out to be close to zero, then essentially you're left with 2 variables. So it's kind of doing the model selection for you. So there are methods like that. So those would be if you want to know any kind of inference about the modeling. But then there's also prediction modeling too. If you want to know, does A predict B? Or if you just simply want to know, are there any sort of relationship between X and Y? So you have different approaches when you do that. So it really depends on the application or the question at hand. So usually when someone asks me about what types of models to use, I always go back to formulate your specific aims. So if you have, say, 3 specific aims in your grant, and your specific aim 1, just formulate it and verbalize it. And once you do that, it's so much easier to write down the model statistically. So just thinking about exactly what you're testing for, just verbalize what your hypothesis is. And that always helps out with translating that into a statistical modeling. Yeah, thanks for the question. Do we have any other questions?
And if anyone has specific questions, but also if there's just anything you run into, you've heard your mentor or other people on your team talking about that you're curious about, or you've just started working on a project and you're just curious to hear more. And thanks to Kwang-Young for being so rolling with the punches here, where we have sort of like asking you, putting on the spot a little bit about summarizing sort of these broad topics. But given that we have such a helpful resource here, if anyone has any questions, whether it's like Julie's question specifically about including adiposity in a model, or you're expecting to be doing survival analysis or logistic regression or multi-level regression, or anything where or something's come up and you've felt like you don't know that much about it, or you're curious about it, feel free to bring up, or just what you're working on that might have a relevant sort of statistical question. Feel free to bring it up, or we could always send early and go back to our work. But this is an opportunity to ask. So anyone who just has things on their mind about data analysis or stats, feel free to bring it up now.
Yeah, I mean, while you guys are thinking about it, one common topic that comes up quite a bit is big data. I don't know if you work on big data, but a lot of times when you have big data, you have to do some sort of dimension reduction techniques. You have to apply them to your data set. And so some of the common topics that you may hear about is principal components analysis, and you may heard of something like random forest, cart, things of that nature. So when you have big data, I think the big issue is that you have so many, the big data usually refers to the number of variables that you have. So you may have, say, 10 observations, but then you have hundreds of thousands of variables, which is a very relevant thing in genetics. So you may have hundreds of tens of thousands of gene expression values where you only have a handful of people. So then you have to reduce the number of dimensions because you can't have an n of 10, but the number of variables is 10,000. So usually your number of variables have to be less than the number of observations, because otherwise you have an overfitting issue, which is a big problem. So yeah, I don't know if you dealt with any big data here in this group. Perhaps not. Okay. Well, then your life is much simpler then.
I wondered if anyone else has questions, feel free to interrupt me, but just thinking about the fact that the T37, everyone's doing health disparities or health equity research. And so what you spoke about before, sort of when you have a collinearity problem and maybe having a score, we see a lot of like deprivation scores or just like overall socioeconomic status that might include income and education. And when you're doing health disparities and health equity research, you might want to tease those apart. I wonder if you have any sort of anything to guide trainees about thinking about that kind of question, where you do have part of the work is you see these things are correlated, like income and education or something. But if you want to try to really understand what's driving disparities, then I imagine that must come up pretty frequently when you're looking at race and ethnicity, poverty, education, and in a typical sort of regression analysis, it gets hard to say what's explaining what, right? So I wonder if there's anything you could share about sort of approaches to trying to work on those kinds of questions where you have these maybe correlated variables, but you really are interested in how they, so partly how they interact or how they interact on a statistical level or just at a more sociological level. So anything that might guide some of the health equity research that trainees are doing.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like some of those questions maybe like a mediation, is it mediation, is it the A driving B, or is it the C that is in between the A and the B that is driving the force? So I think there's been a lot of research in that field recently. So it typically used to be like the Barron and Kenny method, where you test for mediation, where you look at the direct relationship between A and C and B and C, and if A and C exist and B and C exist, then you can see what is the amount of reduction after you adjust for those variables and so forth. I think now these days there are a lot of like causal inference approaches where you're trying to figure out exactly what is the driving force between certain variables. So you could take that type of approach. But in terms of like which variables are more important, again, I think you can go back to those methods where it's the model selection methods are built into selecting the variable itself. And so you would let the model drive you and say, okay, well, I've got these health disparity variables that are associated with certain outcome, and then let's see which one really pans out at the end. And so then you would have maybe one or two variables that are associated with the outcome, but then the other ones are not significant anymore. And so you could look at the progression of how the estimates change along a certain spectrum. So there are methods where you could look for those things and how it progresses. Those are a little bit more advanced in topic. So, if there's enough interest in modeling certain types of approaches, perhaps we can sort of explore that area together, or maybe we can invite someone who does that on a daily basis, or or perhaps point to a talk that that may have discussed a particular topic, because there are a lot of upcoming talks or past talks that may be related to that. So yeah, if there are specific topics that you're interested in, we can explore those options too.
Yeah, we can send out another survey too to try and see where the interest is on specific topics, and maybe we can send that over to you and, and plan for something like that. Yeah. Anybody else have anything they want to ask about or throw out there for these last few minutes? Maybe not. Well, I hope this was helpful. I really appreciate Kwang-Young, you taking the time to just sort of talk through these general issues, and maybe they'll raise questions as trainees go back to their research and start wondering about variable reduction or anything else, and we'll have more specific questions.
Yeah, I mean, I hope it was somewhat helpful, because right now I'm just doing a lot of hand waving. I'm not giving you any specific guidance, but yeah, if you do have more specific questions, I'd be happy to explore further and come up with more detailed answers.
Great. Well, we'll definitely follow up with everyone and see if we can maybe identify some of those issues that we could have a deeper dive, whether with you or someone, or just gather resources. But I appreciate everyone for taking the time to come and asking questions or listening in, and maybe formulating future questions. And Kwang-Young, thank you so much for working with us and taking the time to
Of course.
respond.
Yeah, you're welcome. Nice to meet you all.
Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.